In this lesson, we are continuing talking about the various different economic struggles and challenges that were had during the Gilded Age of the United States. And we're going to talk about some of the consequences that takes place as a result of the implication of what is known as laissez-faire government policy. And we'll talk about the backlash against laissez-faire government policy and mainly against the imposition of all of these monopolistic industries, so places like oil and steel, and the implementation of various pieces of what is known as antitrust legislation. We'll get to this in the future of this lesson. So we've looked so far at specific elements of both government policy and economic policy during the era of Reconstruction in the Gilded Age. We're going to talk about what laissez-faire capitalism actually involves and entails, and we'll talk about how the implementation of such policies took place during this period in the United States. So we can generally define, should I say, the government, or the governments, should I say, of 1865 to 1890, the Reconstruction and Gilded Age period, as a one that is practicing the policy of laissez-faire capitalism. Now, what essentially laissez-faire involves is taking a very distant approach to the intervention of government policy within the markets. So most provisions such as social services and education were the responsibility of individual states, and as a result of which they became highly variable. And when we talk about government, we're focusing mainly on the idea of the federal government. So the federal government would take a very hands-off, very distant approach. So they would take a hands-off approach when it came to things like social services and education, instead opting to let the states choose how to implement policies in relation to both of those different areas. So with education, for example, you might get a different type of education or different quality of education depending on which state you lived in the United States. If you lived in Florida versus if you lived in Texas, for example, what would the difference in education be? Well, that would be up to the state governments rather than imposed by the federal government at a federal level. That is basically the idea of laissez-faire. Federal government did very little also other than to conduct foreign affairs and diplomacy. And even when we talk about foreign affairs and diplomacy, which we'll get to in future lessons, they were relatively isolationist during this period as well. We are going to talk about the role of isolationism that takes place in the United States. Now, this was a relatively isolationist period of US history, but compared to some of the future eras of US history, like for example in the 1920s and the 1930s, we see a significant amount of what is known as isolationism, where essentially the US cuts itself off from the rest of the world, does its own thing, and doesn't really get involved in the world stage and the affairs of global politics. During this period, it was relatively isolationist, but then it gets even more isolationist in the 1920s and the 1930s after the First World War. In terms of congressional government, we know that the Gilded Age is exemplified by a period of weak governance, weak presidents, weak congressional leaders, and corruption. All of these things are entirely the case that we can essentially ascribe to this period of the Gilded Age. For example, Rutherford Hayes believed that Congress should be responsible for solving the nation's problems, not the president or the executive. And so as a result of which, he essentially allowed and devolved Congress to be to Congress all of the issues that was had in the world, in the US. And so as a result, we see a relatively laid-back, laissez-faire president in response to the solving of the nation's problems. Now, he did not initiate any legislation himself. Moreover, President Arthur actually urged Congress to reduce tariffs, but then did little to pursue this issue. So in terms of what the presidents of this period did, they did not and were not particularly proactive in terms of their implementation of policy, in terms of their pushing for legislative reform in relation to some specific areas of policy. The federal government did get involved, in governance from time to time, despite the fact that we have a relatively laissez-faire period. So, for example, under the Harrison administration, this is between 1889 and 1893, Congress spent a significant $1 billion on various different spending programs. Now, of course, $1 billion is a significant amount of money during this period of the late 1800s. They rose tariffs to an all-time high. This became known as the McKinley Tariff of 1890. And they also imposed what is known as antitrust legislation. And we'll get to this in a few more slides' time. Let's just first think about what tariffs involve. Now, a tariff essentially involves putting a charge on the import of some product. Let's say we're importing cars from a different country. We're importing them from Japan, let's say. We're importing Toyotas. And what we do is when we put a tariff on the cars that are imported from Toyota, it means that it will cost more to buy those imported cars than it would for you to buy a car that was built and manufactured in the United Kingdom or in the United States or wherever you are from. And so what a tariff essentially allows is for you to discriminate against foreign imports on the basis of protecting local industry. It's a type of protectionism. Tariffs are generally seen as particularly controversial. When we talk about modern trade regulation and trade law to this day, we aim to try and reduce tariffs as much as possible to have as much frictionless trade throughout the world. That's one of the things that the World Trade Organization exists to do. But at least during the 1890s and the 1880s, we see tariffs being an incredibly important policy when it comes to economic and foreign issues. And the McKinley Tariff of 1890 is no exception. In addition to all of these things, when we talk about the spending that Congress did during 1889 and 1893, they also committed the government to buying, through what is known as the Silver Purchase Act of 1890, 1.4 million ounces of silver each month to produce more money into circulation. So again, a further imposition of silver, which is essentially going to cost the government quite a lot of money. We can think as well that Congress responded to the deep unpopularity of trusts. So we're going to get to the idea of the various different antitrust legislation here. Firstly, we have, for example, the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. What this act said is that all railroad charges should be fair and set up an interstate commerce commission to monitor them. The reason why this is the case, and the reason why this is important, dates back to our previous lesson when we talked about monopolies and monopolistic enterprises. If you remember what I said, if you have a monopoly on an industry that has a certain amount of demand, then you, as that monopoly, have the ability to essentially do whatever you want within that market. You can raise the prices and nobody would be able to say anything otherwise. They could complain, but they wouldn't be able to say anything else because you have the only option to them for supply. And this was one of the things that could happen when we talk about railroads. The railroad industry was relatively monopolistic or was an oligopoly. And so with the Interstate Commerce Act, it dealt with government intervention within the market and essentially said that you have to charge at a fair rate, and we're going to set up an Interstate Commerce Commission to monitor the rates at which you sell your railroad charges at, which is essentially trying to put a limitation on the monopoly of the railroad industry. Railroads were made to publish their rates, and they have they been overcharging smaller scale firms and often rebating the larger ones. While the government was not able to set the rates, this legislation did mark a significant change and an important break away from this idea of laying back laissez-faire government policy and actually getting involved quite significantly within the markets of some of these monopolistic enterprises. And all of these tie into one of the most famous pieces of US legislation that we ever see, which is the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act. Essentially, any trust that restricted trade between states, or the USA and foreign nations was declared to be illegal. It appeared to be an impressive piece of legislation. However, we do note that in terms of its initial goal, in terms of what it set out to achieve, is very different to the actual terms of the provisions within the Act. They were deliberately vague in order to essentially allow for it to be passed and to be not imposed too much of a limitation on all industries within the United States. And it was also weakened by a Supreme Court ruling where the court ruled that the American Sugar Company had not violated the law by taking over a number of its competitors. So the Supreme Court also weakened significantly the impact and the imposition of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Bear in mind the sugar company in question actually controlled 98% of all of the sugar market, which is obviously significantly a monopolistic enterprise.